couldn't lift her arms. That detail arrives before everything else. Before the crowds, before the flames, before the formal language of condemnation, read aloud in a public square. Just a woman, seated in a wooden chair, carried through the streets of London because her body had been dismantled by the very government that was about to kill her. The onlookers would have seen only a composed face above a ruined frame. They would not have known, unless they had heard the whispers, what had been done to her beneath the tower. They would not have known how many times she had been offered the chance to survive, simply by saying names. She never said them. This is the story of Anne Askew, and it begins not with a heretic but with a reader. In the second decade of the 16th century, England was undergoing one of the most violent ideological transformations in its history. A king had broken with Rome. A new church had been declared, with the monarch as its supreme head. But religious reformation in Tudor England was not a clean movement toward liberty. It was a pendulum, swinging between Catholic orthodoxy and Protestant doctrine, depending on political need, personal favour, and the survival calculations of those at the very top. The people caught inside that swing had limited room to manoeuvre. Anne Askew was born into a family of Lincolnshire gentry around 1521. Her father, Sir William Askew, was the kind of minor nobleman the Tudor system depended upon. Landed, loyal, useful. Anne received an education uncommon for women of her station. She read Latin, she read scripture, and the more she read, the more the gap widened between what the official church told her was true and what she found in the text itself. The doctrine she disputed was not peripheral. Transubstantiation, the Catholic teaching that the bread and wine of the Eucharist become, in substance, the literal body and blood of Christ during the Mass, was considered by the Tudor state not merely a theological position, but a political one. Under the Act of 6 Articles, passed in 1539 with penalties so severe that critics called it the whip with 6 strings, denial of this doctrine was a capital offence. The law did not distinguish between a whispered doubt and a published argument. Both could bring a person to the fire. Anne did not whisper. She moved to London in the mid-1540s, likely after an unwanted marriage to a Catholic landowner named Thomas Kyme, a union her father had arranged against her wishes, the story goes, to honour a contract made for a deceased sister. The marriage produced children, and by some accounts, very little else. Anne's religious views made cohabitation volatile. Eventually she came to London, alone, and began moving through Protestant circles with a directness that alarmed the people paid to be alarmed. She preached in public. She engaged clergy in theological argument. She made no secret of her convictions. To men like Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester, and Thomas Wriothesley, who served as Lord Chancellor, this was not a question of spiritual sincerity. It was a question of order. And order, in the England of Henry VIII's final years, was fragile in ways that few outside the inner court fully understood. The king was old and sick. His health was deteriorating. The question of succession, and more importantly, the question of what kind of religious settlement his successor would inherit, was consuming the court. Factions had formed. On one side, conservatives, who wanted the Reformation, rolled back, or at least frozen where it stood. On the other, reformers who saw in the young Prince Edward a chance to complete what Henry had only accidentally begun. The women of the court were not bystanders in this struggle. Catherine Parr, Henry's 6th and final queen, was known to hold evangelical sympathies. She had gathered around her educated women who shared her theological inclinations. Anne Askew moved in overlapping circles, close enough that Wriothesley and Gardiner believed she could give them what they wanted. Names, proof that heresy had penetrated the Queen's household. Leverage. Anne was arrested for the first time in 1545. She was examined, released. The machinery of Tudor law could be slow when men were being careful, testing how far they could push. By 1546, they had decided to push further. She was arrested again, this time with no intention of release. Her formal examinations were recorded. Anne was methodical in her responses. She was not evasive in the way of someone trying to escape. She was precise in the way of someone who had already decided what she believed and had no intention of pretending otherwise. Asked directly whether she believed the sacraments of the altar to be the body and blood of Christ, she answered with Scripture. Asked again, she answered with Scripture again. The interrogators were not accustomed to being answered that way by a woman in a stone room. She was convicted of heresy. Under Tudor law, that should have concluded the legal matter. Conviction meant sentence. Sentence, in this case, meant burning. But Wriothesley and Sir Richard Rich decided the conviction was not enough. They wanted the names that Anne had refused to give, and so they made a decision that even within the documented brutality of Henry's reign stands out as something qualitatively different. They ordered her brought to the Tower. They ordered the rack prepared, and then, by Anne's own account, preserved because she wrote it down, and it was smuggled out of confinement, they operated it themselves. The rack was designed to stretch the body past its tolerances. Wrists bound at one end, ankles at the other. The frame would be tightened until joints separated from their sockets. Ligaments failed, muscles tore. It was used rarely on women. It was virtually never overseen, personally, by officials of the rank of Lord Chancellor. Anne described what happened without theatrical excess. She had been racked, she wrote, because she refused to name any women of her acquaintance as sharing her beliefs. Wriothesley had turned the wheel. When the lieutenant of the Tower refused to continue, reportedly disturbed by what was happening in front of him, Wriothesley and Rich continued without him. When it was over, Anne could not stand. She could not walk. She sat on the cold stone floor of the Tower, her shoulders and hips destroyed, and from that position, according to her own record, she continued to speak with her examiners for another 2 hours. She gave them nothing, not a name, not a recantation, not the performance of defeat they had required. What remains remarkable is not that she survived this because she did not truly survive it. Her body would never recover. What remains remarkable is the texture of her composure. There is no account from any source that suggests she broke. The men who ordered her torture came away with nothing they could use. The women of the court they had targeted, including the Queen, were never formally implicated. Whatever Anne knew, she took with her. The morning of July 16th, 1546, was a public morning. Smithfield, in the northwest of the old city of London, had a history as a site of executions. Markets were held there. Animals were brought to slaughter there. The geography was familiar, and that familiarity was part of its purpose. Public death in Tudor England was designed to communicate. Every detail was a message. Who was present, who presided, how the condemned behaved, whether they recanted. Anne was carried to Smithfield in a chair. She burned alongside 3 other condemned Protestants, men whose names history has largely absorbed into the larger narrative, though they shared her fate. A bag of gunpowder was fastened near her body, a mercy in its grim way, designed to hasten death before the fire consumed her entirely. Bishop Nicholas Shaxton, a former evangelical who had returned to Catholic observance, was appointed to preach at the execution. He addressed the condemned. Anne reportedly paid him no attention. There are accounts that say she stared forward. There are accounts that say she never changed her expression. What every account agrees on is that she did not recant. The fire was lit. She died without confession, without the names Wriothesley had wanted, without any signal that the state had achieved what public execution was supposed to achieve. Her composure at Smithfield was, in the context of Tudor political theatre, a kind of defeat for the men who had ordered her there. In the months following her death, something unexpected happened. Her writings, the examinations she had composed during her imprisonment, precise and defiant, circulated. Protestant printers in Europe reproduced them. John Bale, who had received the smuggled documents, published them with his own commentary. What had been intended as a silencing became, in distribution, an amplification. A generation later, John Fox included Anne Askew in his Acts and Monuments, the martyrology that would shape English Protestant identity for centuries. Her image appeared in his famous woodcuts. Her words were quoted and requoted. The woman who could not walk to her own execution became one of the most cited martyrs of the English Reformation. The men who tortured her fared differently. Wriothesley's influence waned with the king's death. The conservative faction lost its grip in the reign of Edward VI. Richard Rich, adaptable as all Tudor survivors, continued to shift with political winds. History has not remembered either of them kindly, though it has perhaps not remembered them with sufficient darkness. What the story of Anne Askew confronts us with is not simply religious persecution, though it is that. It is the specific mechanics of how power attempts to neutralize not just a body, but a voice, and how, in this particular case, those mechanics failed entirely. She was tortured to produce information. She produced nothing. She was executed to produce silence. She produced a document. The state destroyed her physically and lost the argument completely. There is something in that sequence that resists easy categorization as either victory or tragedy, because it was fully both. The history of the English Reformation is full of people who survived by calculating when to bend. Anne Askew's significance lies partly in the fact that she never made that calculation, or made it and arrived at a different answer than most. The question she leaves behind is not really about her faith. It is about the distance between what power claims to control and what it actually controls, between the body in the chair and the words on the page, between the fire at Smithfield and the text that outlasted it. History carries more stories like hers than we have yet recovered. If you want to keep exploring the ones that have been buried or half forgotten, subscribe and leave a comment below with the figure, the era, or the hidden chapter you think deserves this kind of attention. Someone decided that Anne Askew's story didn't need to survive. They were wrong. There are others waiting for the same correction.